She dug a pit home and lined the walls with stones. Elias Rooker, who had framed 30 houses across the territory, told her flat, "When that roof drops, it will bury you and your boy both." She had $31, one son, and no way to raise a cabin before storm season. On May 10th, 1905, a tornado flattened every standing cabin within a mile in minutes. But 8 weeks earlier, Mara Bell Kincaid had never laid a structural stone in her life. She had arrived in Kiowa County in the spring of 1901 with a husband who talked faster than he worked and a boy not yet 2 years old strapped to her chest. The land opening had drawn thousands. Mara Bell Kincaid was one of the ones who stayed. The claim was 160 acres of flat grass and red dirt, 7 miles southwest of Hobart, Oklahoma Territory. No creek within walking distance, no tree line worth the name. The nearest timber yard charged 4 cents a board foot, and that was before you paid a man to haul it. Most new claimants threw up a frame cabin inside the first season. 4 walls, pitched roof, plank floor if they could manage it, packed earth if they could not. A proper cabin took between $200 and $300 in materials alone, plus labor. Mara's husband, Del Kincaid, had promised he would build one before the first winter. Del Kincaid did not build one before the first winter. What he built was a canvas and wagon plank lean-to that leaked in 3 places and held heat about as well as a sieve holds water. He called it temporary. He said that word so often, Owen learned it before he learned his own last name. Temporary stretched through one winter, then a second, then a third. Del talked about corner posts. He talked about rafters. He measured, marked, and planned. He bought drinks for other men's work crews and came home with promises instead of boards. By the 4th spring, Mara had proved most of the claim requirements herself, planting, improving, residing, while Del proved mainly that a man could talk about building a house for 4 years without lifting a single wall. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March of 1905, Del loaded the wagon with the cut boards he had spent 2 seasons collecting, $14 worth of milled pine and cottonwood, hitched the good mule and drove east toward the railroad without telling her he was leaving. He left the old mule. He left the boy. He left $31 in a tobacco tin under the sleeping pallet and a claim shack made of canvas stretched over wagon planks that would not survive one more season of Oklahoma wind. Mara found the tobacco tin at noon. She counted the money twice. She looked at the lean-to, the old mule, the flat red emptiness in every direction, and the boy sitting in the dirt drawing circles with a stick. She did not cry. She sat on the ground beside Owen, took the stick from his hand, and drew a larger circle around his. Then she stood up, walked to the edge of the quarter section where the canvas flapped like something dying, and tried to understand what she had left. She had $31. She had one 6-year-old son who coughed when the dust blew. She had a mule too old to drag timber from town. She had a lean-to that offered about as much shelter as a man's cupped hands, and she had approximately 8 weeks before the spring storm season that could flatten anything standing upright on open prairie. The math was simple, and the math was fatal. A proper frame cabin required $200 minimum in lumber, nails, and roofing material, plus labor she could not hire and haul distances she could not cover. $31 bought perhaps 40 board feet of milled pine, enough for a door frame and not much else. She could not leave the claim. Abandoning meant forfeiting everything, 4 years of proving, the filing fee, the residence requirement, all of it gone. She had no family in the territory. Her parents were dead. Her one sister had married a railroad clerk in Fort Worth and made it clear that charity was not on offer. She could not build the kind of house that kept people alive on the plains. She could not leave. She could not send Owen somewhere safe. And the weather was coming. 3 days after Del left, a man named Elias Rooker rode up to the claim on a buckskin mare and sat in the saddle for a full minute before he spoke. Rooker was 58 years old. He had driven freight teams from Wichita Falls to the Strip before the openings, built or repaired more than 30 frame structures between Texas and the territory, and buried his own wife in a storm cellar she had begged him to reinforce the year before he got around to it. He carried that fact in his posture, a man who knew exactly how buildings failed and exactly what it cost when they did. He had come because word traveled fast on flat ground, a woman alone on the Kincaid claim, a man gone east with the boards. The settlement was small enough that trouble was everyone's knowledge before it was anyone's help. Rooker dismounted and walked the perimeter of the lean-to without being invited. Mara watched from the cook fire where she was boiling creek water she had hauled that morning in 2 trips. He counted the remaining boards. He tested a canvas joint with his thumb, and it tore. He looked at the tie-down stakes and pulled one out of the ground with 2 fingers. He crouched beside the sleeping pallet where Owen lay napping and looked at the overhead stretch of canvas and the single ridgepole Dell had set crooked. Then he walked back to Mara and spoke the way a man speaks when he is delivering a verdict, not starting a conversation. "You have maybe 9 boards worth keeping," Rooker said. "Rest of this is scrap. Your ridgepole is bowed and your canvas has got 6 months left before it's rags. You need corner posts, a plate beam, roof joists, decking, and sod or shingle on top. That's $180 you don't have and 60 man-days of work you can't do." Mara said nothing. She poured the boiled water into a jar and set it in the shade. "You cannot winter here again," Rooker said. He was not being cruel. His voice carried the flatness of a man stating a measurement. "You cannot storm season here. A May blow will roll this rig into the next county, and your boy with it. You need a proper house, or you need to leave." "I can't leave," Mara said. "Then you need $200 and 4 men for 3 weeks." "I have $31 and no men." Rooker looked at her the way a carpenter looks at a joint that cannot hold, not with contempt, but with the certainty of someone who has seen the failure before it happens. He put his hat back on. "When the spring storms come," Rooker said, "that canvas won't even slow the wind down, and if you're still sleeping above grade when the real weather hits, it won't matter how many years you've proved this claim. The land office doesn't accept dead women's paperwork." He rode away without offering help. He had not come to help. He had come to see how bad it was, and now he knew. Mara stood at the cook fire and watched him shrink against the horizon until the grass swallowed his shape. Owen woke up coughing. She picked him up and held him against her shoulder and felt his ribs through his shirt. 6 years old, and she could count his ribs. She had been told the situation was impossible by a man who had built 30 houses and buried a wife. She had no reason to believe he was wrong. The part of her that had watched Dell leave without screaming, the part that counted money instead of crying, that part was already working, not on grief, on the question. If she could not build up, what could she build? The answer did not come as an idea. It came as a sensation. 4 days after Rooker's visit, Mara was digging clay from a shallow scrape 50 yards south of the lean-to. She had been using the clay to patch gaps in the canvas walls, a futile repair, but the kind of work that kept her hands from shaking. The scrape was about 3 feet deep, roughly oval, carved into the red oak excavated earth, the makeshift ramp Mara had built from scrap boards to wheelbarrow the dirt out, and the growing circle of bare ground. "A house," Nora repeated. 14 feet across, 10 feet deep, stone walls, earth roof. Stone walls. Flat stone from the creek bed, set with inward lean so the dirt presses them tighter. Nora crouched at the edge and picked up a handful of the excavated clay. She crumbled it between her fingers. It was dense and red and held together well when dry, but she had seen what happened to earth walls after a week of rain. "Where does the water go?" Nora asked. "Drainage trench, angled away from the entry side, gravel sump at the low point." "Where does the smoke go?" "Vent pipe, capped opening in the roof with a draw channel." "What happens when the dirt wants its hole back?" Mara stopped digging. She wiped clay from her forehead with the back of her wrist and looked up at Nora. The question was not hostile. It was the question of a woman who had watched enough things fail on the plains to know that the earth did not cooperate with plans. The stone holds it, Mara said. Round walls, inward lean. My father built a cellar this way in Texas. It held 20 years. A cellar is not a house. A cellar that's 10 feet deep and 14 feet wide with a sleeping platform and a cook fire is close enough. Nora looked at the hole, then at Owen sitting on the dirt pile eating cornmeal mush from a tin cup, then at the canvas lean-to flapping in the wind behind them. Elias Rooker says you need a proper cabin or you need to leave, Nora said. Elias Rooker has $200 and a freight team. I have $31 and a mule that can't climb a grade. And if the walls cave, then I dig them out and set more stone. And if the roof falls, then Owen and I are no worse off than we are now, sleeping under canvas that tears if you look at it wrong. Nora stood up. She looked south toward the open prairie where the afternoon clouds were building tall and dark the way they did every spring in Kiowa County. She had 4 children of her own. She understood the math, even if she did not trust the method. I brought cornmeal and sorghum, she said. Clement sent the sorghum. He says it'll keep. Thank Clement for me. I'll come back in a week. If that hole has water in it, I'm dragging you and Owen to my place until you come to your senses. She left the cornmeal, loaded the empty sack on the mule, and walked back north. Mara watched her go, then picked up the mattock and swung it into the clay wall. The impact rang up through her arms and into her shoulders. She swung again. The circle was 5 feet deep and she needed 10. Below her, the earth was cool and still. Above her, the wind pushed clouds east at a pace that made her stomach tighten. 8 weeks to storm season. Maybe less. The word reached Hobart before the week was out. A woman on the Kincaid claim was digging a hole in the ground and claiming she would live in it. Silas Pettigrew heard about it on a Thursday morning while stacking shingle bundles in his supply yard. Pettigrew was 43, owned the only building supply operation between Hobart and Snyder, and had made more money in the 4 years since the land opening than he had made in the previous 15 combined. Every new claimant needed lumber. Every new claimant needed nails, tar paper, shingle, and hardware. Pettigrew did not set the prices, he set the terms, cash or trade, no credit past 60 days, and a surcharge for delivery that made hauling almost as expensive as the materials. A woman building a house out of a hole in creekstone was not a customer. Worse, she was an example. If one claimant proved you could shelter without milled lumber, others would follow. Pettigrew had seen it happen in Texas. One family builds with sod, the next copies, and suddenly the timberman's yard goes quiet. He did not ride out to the claim. That would dignify the project. Instead, he waited for Mara to come to him. She came the following Tuesday, walking the 7 miles to Hobart because the mule could not be spared from the stone-dragging work. She needed short poles, 8 to 10 feet long, thick enough to bear the weight of packed earth across a 14-foot span. She also needed tar paper for the underlayer beneath the sod roof and a handful of iron spikes to pin the timber ring. Pettigrew was behind the counter when she entered. 2 other men were in the yard, Harlan Crisp, a neighboring claimant, and Jem Buckley, who worked seasonal for Pettigrew stacking inventory. Mara asked the price of short poles. 2 cents a running foot, Pettigrew said, for poles under 10 foot. What are you framing? Roof span. What kind of roof? Sawed over brush over poles. Pettigrew leaned on the counter. Sod roof on what walls? Stone. Stone walls on your claim. Yes. The one that's flat as a skillet and 7 miles from anywhere. Mara did not answer. She waited. Pettigrew looked at Harlan Crisp, who was pretending to examine a box of hinges. Jem Buckley had stopped stacking and was listening openly. I heard you're digging a well out there and calling it a house, Pettigrew said. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks when he wants other men to hear and remember. That's your business. But when your well house fills up in the first rain, and you come back here needing real lumber at twice the price because you wasted your spring digging, don't expect me to extend terms I wouldn't give your husband. My husband is not on the claim, Mara said. I know where your husband is. Everybody knows where your husband is. That's my point. You're out there alone with a boy and a shovel, digging something that isn't a house, isn't a cellar, and isn't going to stand through a May storm line. When it fails, you'll need a real structure, and you'll need it fast, and you'll be standing right here with less money than you have now. He straightened up. I'll sell you the poles, cash price, no credit. But I want you to know that I've built 14 houses on claims in this county, and not one of them was a hole in the ground. Mara counted out coins for the poles and tar paper. She did not argue. She did not explain. She loaded what she could carry into a bundle, asked Jem Buckley to hold the rest until she could send someone with a drag, and walked out. Behind her, Pettigrew said to Crisp, loud enough to carry, "She didn't build a house. She's burying herself and calling it one, and when the weather comes, that boy is going to pay for his mother's stubbornness." Mara heard it. She kept walking. 7 miles back to the claim with poles on her shoulders and tar paper under her arm and the spring sun making her shadow long and thin on the red road. The construction began in earnest on the 1st of April, 1905. Mara worked in shifts, dawn until the heat peaked, then rest with Owen in the shade of the lean-to, then back to the pit from late afternoon until dark. The digging was the first phase and the worst. Oklahoma red clay is dense, calcium-rich, and fights the shovel at every depth. Below 4 feet, she hit a harder pan that required the pry bar, and each bar strike sent a shock through her wrists that left them swollen by evening. She dug in a spiral, widening as she deepened, keeping the walls as vertical as the clay would allow. By the end of the first week, the pit was 7 feet deep and roughly 12 feet across, too narrow. She had calculated wrong. 14 feet of living diameter meant 16 feet of excavation to allow for the stone lining. She spent 2 days widening the lower half, hauling the extra dirt up the ramp in a wheelbarrow that lost its left handle on the second trip. Owen helped by standing at the top and telling her when the walls looked crooked. He was 6. His engineering judgment was suspect, but his presence kept her digging when her back seized and her hands bled through the cloth wraps she used for grip. The stone came next. 3 miles southeast, a seasonal creek bed cut through a low break, where flat sandstone lay exposed in slabs ranging from the size of a man's hand to pieces she could barely lever onto the drag sled. She sorted by shape, flat faces for wall work, irregular pieces for fill and chinking. The mule hauled the sled in loads of maybe 300 pounds, moving slowly, stopping often. Each round trip took most of a morning. She needed enough stone to line a circular wall 10 feet high and roughly 50 feet in circumference, stacked in courses with inward lean. By her best estimate, that meant somewhere between 8 and 12 tons of rock. She did not think about 12 tons. She thought about the next load. Then the next. By the second week, the pit was 9 feet deep and the first course of stone was laid on the floor perimeter. She set each piece by hand, flat face inward, leaning the outer edge slightly toward the earth wall so the backfill pressure would press the stones tighter rather than pushing them into the room. Her father's method. Listen for the ring. A clean sound meant a tight fit. A dull thud meant the stone would shift under load. Her hands split at the knuckles. Her shoulders developed a permanent ache from the pry bar. She lost weight she did not have to lose. Her belt cinched 2 notches tighter in 12 days. Owen ate better than she did because she fed him first and ate what remained, which was sometimes nothing but corn mush and creek water. At night, lying on the pallet in the lean-to with Owen curled against her side, she could feel the clock. April was burning away. The clouds built taller every afternoon. 3 weeks into the digging, a thunderstorm dumped 2 inches of rain in an hour, and she spent the entire night bailing water from the pit with a bucket, watching a full day's stonework shift and settle as the clay beneath it softened. The walls had not fallen, but they had moved, and moving meant failure if she did not solve the drainage before the next rain. She needed help she had not asked for. She needed knowledge she did not have. The stone was holding, but the water was winning, and storm season was 5 weeks away, and the pit was only half lined, and the roof was not even started. That night, soaked and shaking, she sat at the edge of the pit and stared into the dark hole where her house was supposed to be. Owen was asleep in the lean-to. The mule stood hobbled nearby, head low. The wind pushed through the grass with a sound like someone breathing. She had bet everything on arithmetic and a dead man's cellar trick, and the earth was not cooperating. If you've ever been told your idea was foolish by someone who didn't understand what you were building, tell us about it in the comments. Because Maribel Kincaid was about to meet the one person who understood exactly what she was trying to do, but that meeting was still 3 days away. And the next rain was closer than that. The rain came again 2 days later, not a storm, just a steady cold drizzle that started before dawn and did not stop until mid-afternoon. Mara spent the morning under the lean-to with Owen, watching water pool at the bottom of the pit. The first 2 courses of stone sat in 3 inches of muddy runoff. The clay beneath them had softened enough that she could see one section of the base course tilting inward, the flat faces losing their angle. She climbed down into the pit when the rain eased. The water was cold against her shins. She pressed her hand against the tilted stones and felt them shift. Not collapse, not yet, but the kind of movement that meant the next hard rain would finish what this one had started. The drainage problem was not a problem she could solve by bailing. She needed to redirect water before it reached the pit. She needed a trench system that carried runoff away from the excavation, and she needed a gravel sump at the entry side to catch what the trench missed. She knew the theory. Her father had dug drainage beside the Texas cellar, but her father had built on a slight grade where water naturally ran downhill. This ground was flat. Water did not leave flat ground. It sat. She was standing in the pit, ankle-deep in muddy water, arguing with physics she could not change, when she heard the mule make a sound she did not recognize, not distress, but attention. Something arriving. She climbed the ramp and saw a man walking across the grass from the southeast, leading a dun horse and carrying a canvas tool roll across his shoulders. He was tall, lean, past 50, with the kind of stillness in his movement that belonged to people who worked stone, deliberate hands, a gaze that measured surfaces before it met faces. He wore a battered felt hat and a long canvas coat patched at the elbows with leather. He stopped 30 feet from the pit and looked into it. Mara stood at the top of the ramp, mud to her knees, a pry bar in her right hand, and waited. "Your batter is wrong," the man said. It was not a greeting. It was not an introduction. It was the first thing he saw and the first thing he said, and it was correct. "I know," Mara said. "You're leaning the stones in, but you're starting the lean too high. First 3 courses should be plumb, vertical. Let the earth settle against a straight face before you start the angle. Otherwise the base slides and everything above it follows." He said this the way a man says something he has said many times before, to many walls that were already wrong by the time he reached them. "Who are you?" Mara asked. "Thomas Redbird," he said. "I repair culverts and retaining walls for the agency crews near Anadarko. I also fix root cellars when people build them wrong, which is often. I didn't ask for help. I didn't offer any. I saw the excavation from the creek road this morning, and I stopped because I wanted to see if you knew what you were doing." He looked into the pit again. "You know about half of what you're doing. The half you know is good. The half you don't will kill you. Mara felt her grip tighten on the pry bar. Not from threat, from the shock of being told precisely what she already feared by someone who could see it in the stonework. "Which half will kill me?" she said. Thomas Redbird set his tool roll on the ground, walked to the edge of the pit, and crouched. He pointed at the base course. "Your drainage is wrong. Flat ground doesn't forgive water. You need a swale cut before the entry side, 8 inches deep, angled southeast so the runoff goes away from the door. Inside, you need a gravel sump, a low point lined with creek gravel that collects whatever seeps past the walls. Without that, every rain fills this room like a bowl." He pointed higher. "Your batter is close, but the angle is too aggressive. You're leaning in at maybe 8 degrees from the second course. That works at the top, near the roof ring, where the span is narrower and the earth pressure is less. At the base, where the full weight of the backfill pushes hardest, you need plumb for the first 3 courses and then a slow lean, 4 degrees, 5 at most, increasing to 8 or 10 only in the top 3 feet. He pointed at the rim of the pit. "And your roof. You don't have a roof plan yet, but I can tell from the diameter and the depth that you're thinking sawed-over poles. That will work if no sayo kuwari and borknosao, and only if. The timber ring at the top of the wall is seated properly, and the rafter poles are short enough to span without flex. 14 feet across means 7-foot rafters from ring to wall, and those rafters need to be thick enough to carry 18 inches of packed earth without bowing. If one rafter bows, the sod above it sags, water pools in the sag, the weight increases, and the roof folds inward." He stood up. "I've seen it happen twice. Both times the people were inside." Mara looked at the pit. She looked at Thomas Redbird. She looked at the base course she had spent 5 days laying, and saw, now that he had named it, the exact angle error he described. The lean started too early. The stones that should have been plumb were already tilted. Under enough backfill pressure, the base would slide inward like a deck of cards pushed from one end. "Can it be fixed?" she said. "The base course needs to be relaid. Pull the first 3 courses, reset them plumb, and relay from there with the corrected angle. It costs you 2 days." "I don't have 2 days to waste." "You don't have a house to waste either." That stopped her. She stood there in the Oklahoma wind, muddy and tired, her hands split at the knuckles and her back aching from a week of pry bar work, and realized that this man was not offering charity. He was not pitying her. He was looking at her stonework, the way Rooker had looked at her claim. Clinically, professionally, and unlike Rooker, he was not pronouncing a death sentence. He was identifying specific, correctable failures, which meant he believed the project could succeed if the failures were fixed. "You said the half I know is good," Mara said. "What's the good half?" Thomas Redbird almost smiled. Almost. "The shape," he said. "Round is right. Round walls distribute earth pressure evenly. Square walls find corners and break there. You chose round, which means you understand the basic physics. You chose flat stone, which is right for dry stack work. You're setting the faces inward, which is right for batter. And you're deep enough. 10 feet below grade in this clay, with proper stone lining, a storm can tear every standing structure off the surface and the room below stays. I've seen earth lodges and root cellars survive weather that flattened frame buildings. The principle is sound. He picked up his tool roll. The execution needs work. That's a different problem. Mara watched him for a moment. The question she wanted to ask felt dangerous, not because the answer might be no, but because the answer might be yes, and then she would owe something she could not pay. "How long are you in the area?" she asked. "I finished a culvert repair near the Washita crossing. I'm riding back to Anadarko in a few days." "A few days is what I need." Thomas Redbird looked at the pit, then at Mara, then at Owen, who had walked over from the lean-to and was standing behind his mother holding a stick. "I don't work for free," he said. "I don't have money." "I didn't say money. I said free." He looked at the lean-to. "I'll sleep on your claim for 3 nights. I'll eat whatever you're eating. I'll show you how to set the drainage, correct the batter, and plan the roof ring. You do the labor. Every stone, every trench cut, every backfill load. I show you once. You do it right or you do it again until it's right." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you already got the hard part. Most people who try to build with stone on flat ground don't dig deep enough, don't choose round, and don't understand batter. You did all 3. You just did them slightly wrong. Slightly wrong is fixable. Completely wrong is not." He unsaddled his horse and set up beside the lean-to without further conversation. Owen watched him from behind Mara's leg, wary and fascinated. Thomas Redbird nodded at the boy and said nothing. That evening they ate cornmeal mush and the last of Nora's sorghum. Thomas pulled a strip of dried venison from his saddlebag and split it 3 ways without comment. After eating, he walked to the pit with a lantern and spent 20 minutes examining the wall by firelight, running his fingers along the stone joints, pressing his palm flat against each course to test the set. Mara stood at the rim and watched. "Tomorrow," he said, "we pull the base course, all of it, and we start again." The next 3 days reorganized everything. Thomas taught the way stone teaches, through weight, angle, and the sound of contact. He did not lecture. He placed a stone, pressed it, listened, and either nodded or pulled it out and placed it again. Then Mara placed the next one. If the ring was clean, he moved on. If it thudded, he said, "Again." And she pulled it and reset it until the sound changed. The drainage trench came first. He marked the line with a stick, a shallow cut, 8 inches deep and 2 feet wide, curving away from the planned entry side of the pit toward a low depression 40 feet southeast. The trench had a barely visible grade, less than 1 inch per 10 feet, but it was enough. Water follows the path of least resistance, and even a slight downhill angle was enough to keep the entry side dry during normal rain. Inside the pit, he showed her the gravel sump, a depression in the floor, 18 inches deep and 3 feet wide, lined with creek gravel, the loose, rounded stone that water could pass through and collect beneath the surface rather than pooling on top. Any seepage through the walls would migrate to the sump, and the sump could be bailed periodically rather than fighting standing water across the entire floor. Mara dug the trench and the sump, while Thomas relayed the base course. She watched him work between her own shovel strokes. His hands moved without hesitation. Each stone went down flat, face plumb, seated with a twist that locked it against its neighbor. He used no mortar, dry stack throughout, but the fit was tight enough that she could not slide a knife blade between the joints. "Round walls do half the work," he said while she rested. "The earth outside pushes in from every direction. In a square wall, the pressure finds the corner, and the corner breaks. In a round wall, the pressure is equal all the way around. Every stone is pushed against its neighbors, and the circle tightens. That's why your father's cellar held 20 years. Not because the stone was special, because the shape was right." On the second day, he taught the roof plan. The timber ring was the key, a circle of the heaviest beam she could find seated on top of the stone wall, pinned in place with iron spikes driven into the stone below. The ring created a continuous bearing surface. Rafter poles laid from the ring to the outer edge of the wall, spaced every 18 inches, would carry the roof load. Over the rafters, brush, then tar paper, then packed earth, then sod. The total weight of the roof would be substantial. Thomas estimated between 2 and 3 tons for the full span, but that weight pressed straight down through the rafter poles into the timber ring into the stone wall and into the earth below. Nothing lifted. Nothing caught the wind. The roof's own mass held it in place. "A cabin roof fights the wind," Thomas said. "It's flat faces and high ridges, and the wind gets under the eaves and peels it back. This roof doesn't fight. It's too heavy and too low. The wind goes over it the way water goes over a stone in a creek." He showed her how to calculate the rafter thickness. A 7-foot span with 18 inches of packed earth on top required poles at least 4 inches in diameter, preferably 5. Thinner poles would flex under the load, and flex led to sag, and sag led to water pooling, and pooled water meant progressive failure. "Every number matters," he said. 4 inches flexes, 5 inches holds. That 1 inch is the difference between a roof and a grave. On the third morning, before he saddled his horse, Thomas walked the perimeter of the pit one more time. The base course was relaid plumb. The second and third courses were in progress, Mara setting them with a precision that had not been there 5 days earlier. The drainage trench was cut, and the sump was lined. "You'll finish the walls in 2 weeks if the weather holds," he said. "The roof will take another week after that. You have the shape and the drainage right. Don't rush the upper courses. The batter angle is everything above the 5th course, 4 degrees, then 5, then gradually steeper to 8 at the top. If you lose the angle, the wall bulges outward and the earth behind it has nowhere to go." He paused. "And the vent. When you build the roof, leave an opening at the crown 12 inches across, no more. Line it with stone so it holds its shape. Cap it with a flat stone you can slide on and off. That's your chimney, your air source, and your pressure valve. If you seal the room completely, the air goes bad inside a day." Mara nodded. She did not ask him to stay. She did not thank him in a way that suggested debt. She shook his hand the way she would shake the hand of any man she respected, and Thomas Redbird rode southeast toward Anadarko, with his tool roll across his saddle and his horse picking its way through the buffalo grass. Owen waved from the dirt pile. Thomas raised a hand without turning. Mara went back to work. She had 2 weeks to finish the walls, a week for the roof, and maybe a week of margin before May brought the weather that would test everything. The math was still tight, but the math had changed. She was no longer guessing. She was building to specifications that someone who understood stone had verified. The question was no longer whether the design could work. The question was whether she could finish it in time. She could not have finished alone. The next 2 weeks blurred into a rhythm of stone and sweat. She hauled rock every morning, dawn trips to the creek bed, loading the sled, leading the mule back at a pace the animal could sustain without going lame again. Each load averaged 300 pounds. She made 2 trips a day when the mule held up, one when it did not. At night, she set stone by lantern light, fitting each piece by feel and sound the way Thomas had shown her, palm flat, press, listen for the ring. The 4th course went up in 3 days. The 5th took 4 because the diameter was narrowing as the batter angle increased, and each stone needed to be trimmed with the pry bar to fit the tighter curve. Her hands were past blistered now. The skin had hardened into a kind of permanent callus that cracked and bled at the knuckle lines. She wrapped them in strips cut from Dell's abandoned shirt and kept working. Owen counted stones. He could not lift them, but he could tally them, and every evening he told her how many she had placed that day. 22, 18, 27 on a good day. She tracked progress against the remaining wall height and the narrowing calendar. On April 14th, 10 days after Thomas left, Nora Voss returned. She brought cornmeal, a jug of buttermilk, and Clement, who had come home from the freight run with a bruised rib and a willingness to work that Nora had converted into conscripted labor. Clement was a quiet man with big hands who understood the value of not having opinions about things he did not understand. He looked at the pit, now 8 feet deep with 6 courses of stone lining and a functional drainage trench, and said simply, "What do you need moved?" He hauled stone for 2 days. The loads he could manage were twice what Mara's mule could pull. He said almost nothing while he worked, but on the second evening, sitting at the cook fire eating Mara's cornmeal, he looked at the pit and said, "That's going to stand." It was not a technical assessment. It was the judgment of a man who had moved enough heavy things to know when weight was settled right. Mara finished the stone wall on April 22nd. The last course sat 8 feet above the pit floor, tapering inward to a diameter of roughly 10 feet at the rim, 4 feet narrower than the base. The inward lean of the upper courses created a shape that was almost, but not quite, a dome. The remaining gap at the top would be spanned by the timber ring and the rafter poles. The roof took 6 days. She set the timber ring on the morning of April the 23rd, 4 heavy cottonwood beams, each about 10 feet long and 6 inches thick, bent to follow the curve of the wall top and spiked together into a rough circle. The ring sat on the top course of stone and was pinned with the iron spikes she had bought from Pettigrew. Rafter poles went up next, 22 of them, 5 inches in diameter, laid from the ring to the outer wall edge at 18-inch intervals. Each rafter extended past the wall by 2 feet, giving the roof a slight overhang that would shed surface water away from the entry. Over the rafters, she laid a lattice of willow brush collected from the creek bed. Over the brush, tar paper. Over the tar paper, packed earth. 8 inches of clay tamped by hand and by the flat of the shovel. Over the earth, sod, cut from the prairie in rectangular strips and laid grass side up so the roots would knit the surface together. The vent was a 12-inch opening at the crown, lined with 4 flat stones set vertically and capped with a slab she could slide on and off. When the cap was open, the pit drew air down through the entry cut and up through the vent, creating a draft that pulled smoke from the cook fire and kept the air fresh. When the cap was closed, the room sealed almost entirely, holding heat in winter and blocking dust in wind. The entry was a ramp cut from the surface down to the pit floor at a steep angle, lined with flat stone on the floor and framed with timbers at the top. A plank door, built from the remaining boards Mara had bought from Pettigrew, hung on leather hinges and barred from the inside with a cottonwood beam. On April 29th, Mara carried the sleeping pallet and Owen's bedding down the ramp and set them on the raised sleeping platform, a plank surface built 18 inches above the pit floor, above the sump level, above any water that might seep in. Owen climbed down and sat on the platform and looked up at the underside of the sod roof, where roots were already pushing through the earth layer and tiny white threads of grass hung like fringe. "Smells like the ground," Owen said. "It is the ground," Mara said. They slept underground for the first time that night. The air was cool and still. The wind howled above them, and the grass muffled it to a whisper. No canvas flapped, no ridgepole creaked. The stone walls held the dark with a weight that felt permanent, as if the room had always been there and they had simply found it. $31, 1 mule, 1 dead man's cellar trick. 5 weeks of labor that had cost her 8 pounds of body weight, the full use of her left ring finger where a stone had crushed the knuckle, and every remaining ounce of faith that the world would cooperate with her arithmetic. The walls stood, the roof held, the vent drew, the drainage worked. But the weather had not tested it. Not really. Thunderstorms had passed, and the pit had stayed dry. Wind had blown, and the roof had not lifted, but Elias Rooker's words hung over the claim like a second sky. True wind had not come. Not the kind that flattened frame houses and turned lumber into projectiles. Not the kind that killed. That test was 11 days away. The first week of May brought the kind of heat that does not belong to spring. The air went thick and wet. The sky turned colors that had no name, green at the edges, yellow-gray at the center, bruised purple along the western horizon in the late afternoons. Old-timers in Hobart said the atmosphere felt loaded. They could not say what it was loaded with, but they could feel it the way a man feels a low ceiling, something pressing down. Mara spent those days reinforcing. She deepened the drainage trench by 4 inches after Thomas's instructions echoed in her head. She packed additional earth onto the roof crown where the sod had settled unevenly. She tested the door bar by leaning her full weight against it and checking the beam for flex. She trimmed the vent cap so it seated flush. Elias Rooker came back on May 3rd. He did not dismount. He sat on the buckskin mare and looked at the low green mound where a hole in the ground used to be. The only visible features were the stone-rimmed entry cut, the vent pipe rising a foot above the grass, and a faint trail worn in the sod by Mara's daily trips to haul water. "You finished it," Rooker said. "I finished it. It's cooler inside than the air out here. I'll grant that. And the draft pulls clean." "Yes, but that's a thunderstorm test, maybe a wind test. That is not a tornado test, and it is not a flood test, and May in Kiowa County delivers both." He looked at the sky, which was doing the yellow-gray thing again. "When the real weather comes, and it will, I hope those walls hold the way you think they will, because if that roof comes down with you and Owen inside, the weight of it won't leave anything to bury." He rode away. Mara watched him go and felt the familiar tightness in her chest, not fear exactly, but the knowledge that the man was not entirely wrong. A sod and earth roof over a 10-foot deep pit, held by 22 rafter poles and a timber ring she had spiked together herself. If the rafters failed, the roof would not blow away. It would fall inward, tons of earth dropping into a room the size of a large well. She went inside and checked every rafter joint with her hands. She pressed each pole where it met the ring and felt for give. She found none. But she checked again the next morning and the morning after that. Owen asked her why she kept looking at the ceiling. "I'm counting," she said. "Counting what?" "Making sure everything is still there." The boy accepted this. He was 6. He had learned that his mother counted things when she was worried, and that counting usually meant things would be all right. On May 8th, the barometric pressure dropped fast enough that the water in Mara's cook pot rippled without anyone touching it. The air smelled of copper and wet stone. Nora Voss sent Clement with a message. A storm line was building in the southwest, and the old-timers said it had rotation in it. Clement delivered the message and left. He had his own family to shelter. On May 9th, the sky went green. On May 10th, 1905, the morning started warm and still. No wind, no bird song. The grass stood straight up as if it had forgotten which direction to lean. Mara cooked breakfast over the pit's cook fire. The vent was drawing well, the smoke pulling straight up through the crown opening, and the air inside was 10 degrees cooler than the surface. Owen ate cornmeal and a boiled egg from Nora's last delivery. He was feverish. A low heat in his forehead that Mara had been tracking for 2 days, not high enough to be dangerous, but present enough to worry her. She climbed the entry ramp at mid-morning and looked southwest. The horizon was wrong, not cloudy, wrong. The sky had separated into layers, a low gray shelf moving fast to the northeast, and above it a higher mass of black that did not seem to move at all, as if the upper atmosphere had frozen while the lower part ran. The air pressure was so low that her ears felt thick. Thomas Redbird was 4 miles away, helping the Pruitt family reinforce a root cellar they had started too late and finished too shallow. She did not know this yet. She would learn it later. What she knew at mid-morning on May 10th was that the sky looked like nothing she had seen in 4 years on the plains, and that Owen was too warm, and the air was too still, and the horizon was the wrong color. At noon, the wind started. Not gradually, it went from nothing to a sustained blow in less than a minute, and the blow came from the south with enough force to flatten the grass in a single visible wave that raced north across the prairie like a hand pressing down a carpet. Mara felt it hit the lean-to, the old canvas structure she had kept standing as a surface shelter for tools and cooking, and heard the ridgepole snap. The canvas peeled away in one piece and cartwheeled north until it wrapped around a fence post 200 yards out. She gathered Owen and went down the ramp. The door bar seated with a sound she could feel in her ribs, the cottonwood beam dropping into the timber brackets, solid and heavy. She slid the vent cap half closed, leaving a 2-inch gap for air. The cook fire was out. The lantern was lit. Owen sat on the sleeping platform with a blanket around his shoulders and his eyes wide. "Is it a storm?" he asked. "Yes." "A bad one?" Mara listened. The wind above them had shifted from a blow to a roar, not the gust and pause rhythm of a thunderstorm, but a constant escalating pressure of sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. The stone walls held the noise at a distance, the way water holds sound from the surface when you are submerged. She could feel the air in the pit change, a slight pulse, in and out, as the atmospheric pressure outside shifted in ways the sealed room could not fully match. "Stay on the platform," she said. "Don't come near the door." At 12:40, someone pounded on the entry door. Mara heard it beneath the wind, a rhythmic banging, human, desperate. She went to the door and pressed her ear against the planks. A voice, female, shredded by the wind into fragments. "Please, children, please open." She lifted the bar. The wind grabbed the door and slammed it inward. Standing in the entry cut, hunched against the gale, was Clara Dunfree, a woman Mara knew only from supply day encounters in Hobart. And behind Clara, 2 children, a girl of 8 and a boy of 10. Clara's face was bleeding from a cut above her left eye. The boy was carrying the girl, who was not moving. "Our cabin came apart," Clara said. "The roof went first, then the south wall." Mara pulled them inside and threw her weight against the door. The wind resisted. She braced her boots against the stone floor and shoved, and the door ceded, and she dropped the bar. The room was suddenly crowded, 5 people in a space built for 2, plus a lantern, a cook pit, a sleeping platform, and the sound of the world ending above them. Clara's daughter had been struck by a flying board. A gash on her forearm, deep enough to show white, and her left hand was swollen. Mara tore strips from a blanket and bound the wound while Clara held the girl, and the boy sat on the floor with Owen and stared at the stone walls. The sound deepened. At 12:55, the roar above them changed pitch. It dropped, a shift from high screaming wind to a low grinding vibration that Mara felt in her teeth. The stone walls hummed. Dust sifted from the underside of the sod roof in thin streams, falling through the lantern light like gray snow. Owen pressed against the wall, and Mara saw his hands shaking. Then something hit the roof. Not the tap of debris, a deep, percussive impact that made the rafter poles flex visibly. One of them, the third from the entry side, bowed downward, half an inch, and held. Dirt fell from the seam where the pole met the sod layer. The children screamed. Clara pulled her daughter to the center of the room, away from the walls. Mara looked up. The rafters held. The timber ring held. The weight of the roof pressed down 2 or 3 tons of earth, sod, and brush, and the poles carried it, and the ring carried the poles, and the stone carried the ring. Thomas's math, 5 inches of diameter. The difference between a roof and a grave. A second impact. Heavier. The entire room shuddered, and the vent cap rattled against its stone collar. Mara grabbed the cap and held it in place with both hands while the air pulsed. In, out, in, as pressure waves rolled over the buried structure. The gap she had left for ventilation was whistling now, a high, thin sound like a reed instrument being played by something enormous. If you're watching this and your heart is pounding, hit subscribe now, because what happened in the next 15 minutes changed everything for the people of Kiowa County. At 1:10, she heard the second knocking. This one was different, lower on the door, weaker, the sound of a fist with no strength behind it, and a voice she recognized. Kincaid, open the door. Elias Rooker. She could not open the door. The wind was still tearing past the entry cut with enough force that she could hear debris skipping off the stone-lined ramp, pieces of wood, metal, things that had been parts of houses. Opening now meant exposing the room to the full throat of the storm. It meant risking the door being torn off. It meant the pressure change could lift the vent cap and start the cascade Thomas had warned about. Air breach, pressure shift, roof peel. She pressed her hands against the door and felt it vibrate. I can't open yet, she shouted. The wind is still carrying debris. Rooker's voice came back, raw and broken. I've got Harlan Crisp. His leg is bad. We need cover. Mara looked at the room. 5 people already. The platform was full. The floor space between the platform and the walls was barely enough for 2 adults to sit. Harlan Crisp with a bad leg meant a man who could not stand, could not fold himself small, could not be stacked. She looked at the ceiling. The rafters had taken 2 major impacts and held. The vent was still sealed. The walls were solid. The room was built for 2 and was already holding 5. She waited. The wind noise dropped, not stopped, but dropped from annihilating to merely violent. The debris sounds against the ramp thinned. At 1:18, she lifted the bar. Rooker half-carried, half-dragged Harlan Crisp down the entry ramp. Crisp's right leg was bent at the shin in a way legs do not bend. His face was gray. Rooker himself had blood on his scalp, and his left arm hung at an angle that suggested a dislocated shoulder. Behind them, the sky was a color Mara had never seen and never wanted to see again, a sickly brownish green churning, with visible rotation in the clouds to the southwest. She barred the door. 7 people, a room built for 2, a lantern, a cook pit, and stone walls in every direction. The tornado, or what was left of it, passed over the claim sometime between 1:20 and 1:40. Mara did not know the exact minute because she was holding the vent cap with both hands and counting Owen's breaths and listening to Harlan Crisp moan each time the pressure shifted and his broken shin moved. The sound above them was not wind anymore. It was demolition, timber breaking, something metallic screaming as it twisted. A series of impacts on the roof, lighter now, scattered, like hail made of houses. The rafter that had bowed earlier bowed again, a 1/4 inch more. Dirt fell in a curtain. Clara Dunfree covered her daughter's face. Owen pressed his body against Mara's leg, and she felt his fever through the cloth. The rafter held. A 1/4 inch of flex in 5 inches of cottonwood. Thomas Redbird's math, holding weight against violence, because the numbers were right and the diameter was right and the ring was right and the stone was right. At 1:45, the sound began to retreat. The grinding vibration moved northeast, the way a train sounds when it passes through a station without stopping, the pitch dropping, the volume fading, the shaking in the floor diminishing by degrees until it was only the normal howl of high wind across open prairie. Mara waited. She counted to 300. 5 minutes of silence, or what passed for silence after the worst sound she had ever heard. Then she lifted the bar and pushed the door open and climbed the ramp. The lean-to was gone, not collapsed. Gone. The canvas, the poles, the wagon planks, every piece of Del Kincaid's 4-year temporary shelter had been removed from the earth as if it had never existed. The fence line to the north was stripped to bare wire. The mule was standing in the drainage trench, alive, shaking, pressed against the ground as if trying to become part of it. To the south and west, where the crisp claim and 2 other homesteads stood, there was nothing. Not damaged structures. Nothing. The frame cabins that had stood upright with plank walls and pitched roofs and proper corner posts. The kind of houses Elias Rooker said a person needed to survive, were gone. Boards, shingles, nails, furniture, bedding, tools, scattered across the prairie in a debris field that extended farther than Mara could see. The pit home stood. The sod roof had lost a section of surface turf on the southwest side, exposing the packed earth beneath. The vent cap had cracked, a clean break through the center of the flat stone. The entry ramp had debris piled against it, a broken chair, a tangle of wire, a piece of roofing tin from someone else's house. But the walls were intact. The timber ring was intact. The 22 rafter poles were intact, including the one that had bowed a 1/4 inch under impact and held. A buried house, standing in a field of nothing. Mara went back down. She told Rooker and Clara and the children that the storm had passed. She told them what was above. She did not describe it in detail because Harlan Crisp was still moaning, and Clara's daughter was still bleeding, and Owen was still feverish, and there would be time later for the scope of what had happened. She boiled water for Crisp's leg. She rebandaged the girl's arm. She gave Owen a damp cloth for his forehead and sat beside him until his breathing steadied. 7 people in a room built for 2, underground, in the only intact shelter within a mile. The house Elias Rooker said she could not build had just held 7 people through a tornado that erased every proper cabin in sight. But Rooker had not said thank you yet. He was sitting on the stone floor with his dislocated shoulder against the wall and his eyes on the ceiling, watching the rafter that had bowed and held, watching the dust still sifting from the seams. And Mara could see him counting, not stones, not rafters, something else. The distance between what he had said and what had happened. The storm had passed. But the settlement was in pieces, and the only standing room belonged to the woman everyone had said was burying herself alive. The afternoon of May 10th was not about relief. It was about wounds. Harlan Crisp's shin was broken clean through. Mara could feel the separation under the swollen skin when she pressed gently along the bone. She splinted it with 2 flat sticks and strips torn from the sleeping pallet cover, working by lantern light while Crisp bit down on a leather strap and made sounds that Owen would remember for years. Clara Dunfrey's daughter, whose name was Emmeline, had stopped bleeding, but the gash on her forearm needed cleaning that Mara could only approximate with boiled water and a torn cloth. Rooker's shoulder was dislocated. He sat against the stone wall and told Mara to pull his arm straight out and twist. She did. The joint popped back with a sound like a knuckle cracking, and Rooker did not scream, but his face went white and he sat very still for several minutes afterward. 7 people spent the night in the pit. Mara gave the sleeping platform to Clara and the children. Crisp lay on a blanket on the stone floor with his leg elevated on a folded sack. Rooker sat against the wall near the entry and did not sleep. Mara sat beside Owen, who was still feverish, and fed the cook fire just enough to keep water warm. No one spoke much. The wind above had dropped to ordinary gusts, but every gust made Emmeline flinch and press against her mother. Owen slept fitfully, waking every hour to cough and ask if the sound was coming back. At dawn on May 11th, Mara climbed the ramp and looked out at what the settlement had become. The destruction was not uniform. Tornadoes cut paths, wide or narrow, veering, skipping, and the path that had crossed the Kincaid claim and the surrounding homesteads had been wide. To the southwest, toward Snyder, the damage was worse. She could see dust still hanging in the air 7 miles out, a brown haze that marked where buildings had stood and no longer did. Closer, the crisp claim was bare ground. The Dunfree place, half a mile north, had one wall standing and nothing else. Fence posts were snapped at the base or pulled from the ground entirely. A dead horse lay in the drainage ditch 200 yards east, its body already drawing flies in the May heat. The pit home had surface damage, the sod tear on the southwest face, the cracked vent cap, debris piled against the entry, but the structure was intact. The walls had not shifted. The timber ring was seated, the doors still barred and unbarred. The drainage trench, cleared of debris, still carried water away from the entry when Mara poured a bucket into it to test. She went back down and told the others. Rooker was the first to climb the ramp. He stood on the surface for a long time, turning slowly, taking in the absence of everything that had stood upright within sight. His own claim was 2 miles east. He did not ask about it. He already knew. He turned back toward the pit entry, the low green mound of the sod roof, the stone-rimmed cut of the ramp, the thin trail of smoke rising from the cracked vent. A house that looked like the ground itself, still breathing. He came back down the ramp and stood in the room where he had spent the night. He put his good hand against the wall, the stone wall that Mara had set course by course, each piece pressed and listened to. The batter-angle climbing from plumb at the base to 8 degrees at the top, the way Thomas Redbird had shown her. Rooker's palm moved across the flat faces of the sandstone, the way a man touches something he is trying to understand. "I told you this roof would come down on your boy," Rooker said. His voice was flat, not angry, not humble. Flat, the way a man speaks when he's revising something he was certain of. "I told you the weight would not hold, and the wind would find a way in, and the whole thing would fold. I was wrong." He took his hand off the wall. "I've built 30 houses in the territory. Every one of them stood upright and square and tall enough to see from a mile out. Not one of them would be standing this morning." He looked at Mara. "Your roof held 7 people through a tornado that took apart every frame cabin I've ever built. I don't understand all of it, but I was wrong, and the fact that I was wrong is the reason I'm alive right now." Mara said nothing. She was holding Owen, who had climbed into her lap when Rooker started talking, and she was listening to her son's breathing, which was still fast but cooler than it had been the night before. The fever was breaking. She pressed her hand against his forehead and felt the heat retreating, and for the first time in 36 hours she thought about something other than whether the next sound would be the ceiling falling. Clara Dunfree said it more simply. She was standing at the base of the ramp with Emmeline and her son, looking up at the circle of sky visible through the entry cut. "We would be dead," Clara said. "If you hadn't opened the door, we would be dead." Over the next 3 days, the pit home became something it was never designed to be. It became the only intact enclosed structure within 1.5 miles of the Kincaid claim, and that made it the place where people gathered. Clement Voss arrived on the morning of the 12th with a wagon loaded with blankets, water, and a sack of flour. The Voss claim, 2 miles northeast, had been at the edge of the tornado's path. Their cabin lost its roof, but the walls held, and Nora had spent the night with her 4 children in the root cellar Clement had dug the previous fall. Nora sent supplies before she sent questions. That was the kind of woman she was. Clement hauled Harlan Crisp to Hobart in the wagon that afternoon. Crisp's leg needed setting by someone who knew bones, and the closest person with that knowledge was a doctor in Snyder who was, by all accounts, overwhelmed. The tornado had killed at least 100 people in and around Snyder. The number would climb in the days that followed as search parties reached outlying claims. Mara's pit became the gathering point for the immediate area, not because anyone appointed it, but because it was there. People came to check on their neighbors and found neighbors already inside the pit, sitting on the stone floor drinking boiled water, talking about what they had lost. 2 families from claims to the south arrived on the 13th with children and salvage tools and nowhere to go. Mara let them camp above the pit and use the entry for shelter when the afternoon thunderstorms rolled through. The room that had been a gamble, a buried house, a thing neighbors laughed at, was now the center of a small, shattered community. That transformation did not happen because Mara announced it. It happened because the room was still standing and everything else was not. Nora Voss came on the 14th. She walked the perimeter of the pit home, descended the ramp, stood in the center of the room, and looked at the walls the way she had looked at the excavation 6 weeks earlier, with the careful attention of a woman who had been wrong and wanted to understand why. "Where does the water go?" Nora asked. It was the same question she had asked in April, standing at the edge of a muddy hole. "Drainage trench," Mara said. "Gravel sump inside. Thomas showed me the angle." "Where does the smoke go?" "Vent at the crown. It cracked in the storm, but the draw still works." "What happens when the dirt wants its hole back?" Mara touched the wall. The stone was dry, cool, and locked as tight as the day she had set it. The earth behind it had not moved. The batter held. The circle held. "The dirt gave up," Mara said. Nora looked at the wall for a long time. Then she said, "I want you to show me how to build one." Not build one for her. Show her how. The distinction mattered. Nora was not asking for charity. She was asking for knowledge, the way Thomas Redbird had given it to Mara, through demonstration, through the expectation that the student would do the work. "I'll show you," Mara said. "But you dig every stone." Nora nodded. She had expected nothing less. Rooker's conversion was public, and that mattered more than the private admission in the pit. On May 16th, 6 days after the tornado, a group of settlers gathered at the Hobart supply yard to discuss rebuilding. 14 families had lost structures. 3 families had dead. The settlement was in the kind of crisis that either binds a community or scatters it, and the question at the center of the meeting was simple. What do we build now? Pettigrew was there, standing behind his counter in a supply yard that was suddenly the most important building in the county. Lumber prices had not gone up yet, but everyone knew they would. Demand was about to surge, and Pettigrew was the supply. He stood with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression of a man who was about to be very busy and very profitable. Rooker spoke first. He did not ask for the floor. He simply started talking, and people listened because he was Elias Rooker, and he had built more houses than anyone in the room. "I was in the Kincaid pit when the tornado hit," Rooker said. "I was there because my own cabin, the one I built with proper corner posts and a pitched roof and enough lumber to cost me $190, was in pieces around me, and I had nowhere else to go." The room was quiet. The Kincaid house is 10 feet underground, 14 feet across, lined with stone, and roofed with sod. I told Mara Kincaid it would collapse on her and her boy. I told her the roof would come down. I was in that room with 7 people when the same storm that flattened every standing structure in sight passed over us, and the roof held. The walls held. The floor stayed dry. A rafter bent a 1/4 inch and came back. He looked at Pettigrew. I'm not saying we should all dig holes. I am saying that the woman I told was building her own grave, built the only shelter that survived, and I think we should ask her how she did it before we spend good money building the same kind of house that just killed people. Pettigrew's expression did not change, but his arms unfolded, and Mara noticed that his hands were not still. They were working against each other, the fingers pressing and releasing, the gesture of a man whose arithmetic was being rewritten against his will. The meeting did not end with a resolution. Meetings on the frontier rarely did, but it ended with a question that had not existed before the tornado. Was the safest house the one that stood tallest, or the one that disappeared? Thomas Redbird returned to the Kincaid claim on May 19th. He had been at the Pruitt place when the tornado hit. The Pruitt cellar, the one he had been helping reinforce, had held. The Pruitt cabin above it had not. Thomas had spent the days after the storm helping the Pruitts dig out their belongings from the debris and shoring up the cellar walls where the ground shaking had loosened 2 courses of stone. He walked the perimeter of Mara's pit the way he had walked it the first time, crouching at the edge, running his hand along the stone, checking the batter, pressing the joints. He went inside. He looked at the rafter that had bowed. He tapped it with his knuckle and listened to the sound. 1/4 inch, he said. 1/4 inch, Mara confirmed. 5-inch pole. If you had used 4-inch, that bow would have been 1/2 inch, and at 1/2 inch the sod above it would have sagged, and the sag would have pooled water, and the water would have doubled the weight on that one spot. You told me that. I told you the math. The storm told you I was right. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully. The math held. They sat in the pit with Owen, who was recovered enough to be bored and restless, and Thomas asked Mara to walk him through the construction sequence from the beginning, not because he did not know what she had done, but because he wanted to hear her describe it in her own words. Her description of the batter correction, the drainage trench angle, the rafter spacing, and the vent design told him what she had internalized and what she was still repeating from memory. You understand the drainage better than you understand the roof, he said. The drainage you figured out from watching water. The roof you're reciting from what I told you. When you teach someone else, and you will, you need to understand the roof the way you understand the drainage, from the inside, not from my words. How? Build another one. The collaboration between Thomas and Mara deepened over the next 3 weeks. He did not move to the claim, he camped nearby, returning to Anadarko periodically for work, then riding back. But when he was present, they worked together with an efficiency that neither had alone. The first project was Nora's cellar. Not a full pit home, Nora's cabin had survived with its walls intact, so she needed storm shelter, not permanent housing. But the principles were the same. Circular, stone-lined, below grade, with proper drainage and a heavy roof. Thomas let Mara lead the instruction. He stood aside and watched her show Nora how to mark the circle with a peg and rope, how to test the stone ring by ear, how to calculate the batter angle by counting courses. When Mara got something wrong, Thomas did not correct her in front of Nora. He waited until they were alone and said, You told her the sump should be 12 inches deep. It should be 18. 12 catches the first seep. 18 catches the storm seep. The difference matters. You could have said that while she was digging. Then she would have learned it from me. She needs to learn it from you, and you need to learn it from your own mistake. Next time you're building too large a cook fire for the room volume, I'm building a cook fire large enough to boil water for 7 people, which is what I had to do when the storm brought the entire county into my house. 7 people is not normal use. You design for normal. You prepare for emergency. I'm not designing for normal. I'm designing for the next time the sky falls. Thomas looked at her. She looked back. Neither yielded. The silence between them had weight, not hostility, but the particular friction of 2 people who respected each other enough to argue honestly. 12 inches, Thomas said finally. But you cap it with a stone you can slide to 8 in clear weather, both widths available. The structure decides nothing permanently. The person living in it decides based on conditions. That's what I have now. I know, I'm agreeing with you. I'm doing it slowly because I wanted you to defend the position before I conceded it. Mara stared at him. Then she laughed, the first real laugh Owen had heard from his mother since before the tornado. The boy looked up from his stone throwing and grinned without knowing why. Thomas Redbird left the Kincaid claim for the last time on June 22, 1905. He did not leave because he wanted to. He left because his sister's family near Anadarko needed him. Her husband had been injured in a construction accident, and the household required the kind of steady labor that Thomas could provide. He told Mara 3 days before he left, sitting at the edge of the pit in the evening light, watching Owen chase a grasshopper across the red dirt. "You don't need me for the next one," he said. "You know the walls, you know the drainage, you know the roof. The only thing I could teach you now is patience, and the storm already taught you that better than I could." "The storm didn't teach me patience, it taught me speed." "Same thing, depending on which part of the work you're doing." He gave her his best pry bar, a forged iron tool with a slight curve at the tip that he had used for 20 years of stonework. It was worn smooth at the grip and heavy enough that Mara had to adjust her swing when she first used it. He did not make a ceremony of it. He set it against the pit wall and said, "The curve helps on the upper courses. You'll feel it." On the morning he rode away, Mara walked with him to the edge of the claim. Owen stayed behind at the pit, stacking small stones in a circle the way he had watched his mother do for weeks. Thomas mounted and gathered the reins. Then he said, "The round wall holds because every stone depends on the stone beside it. None of them are strong enough alone. That's not a weakness in the design. That's the design." He touched the brim of his hat and rode southeast. Mara stood at the edge of the claim and watched him until the grass swallowed him the way it had swallowed Elias Rooker 2 months earlier. But Rooker had left her with a verdict. Thomas left her with a method. The difference between those 2 departures was the distance between being told she would fail and being shown she could succeed. She walked back to the pit. Owen had finished his circle of stones, 8 of them, arranged with the flat faces inward, leaning slightly toward the center. The batter was wrong. The lean was too steep, but the shape was round and the instinct was right. "Good circle," she said. "But pull the 3rd one." "It's fightin' the 4th. Owen pulled the 3rd stone, turned it, and set it again. The fit tightened. "Better," Mara said. She picked up Thomas's pry bar and went to work on the vent repair. The cracked capstone needed replacing, and she had a flat piece of sandstone she had been saving that was almost the right diameter. Almost right was not right. She would trim it until it was. The work did not stop because the teacher was gone. The work continued because the teaching had landed. If this story reminds you why preparation matters more than luck, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because what Mara built next proved that the lesson was bigger than one house. The secondary crisis arrived in early August, not from the sky, but from the ground. A family named Hollister had taken a claim 2 miles south of the Kincaid place in June, part of the wave of new settlers arriving to replace those who had fled after the tornado. The Hollisters, Ray, his wife Margaret, and 3 children under 7, had heard about Mara's pit home and had attempted to build a storm cellar on their own. They had the shape right, round, dug 8 feet deep, lined with stone from the same creek bed Mara used. They had the batter approximately right. What they did not have was drainage. They had skipped the trench. They had skipped the sump. They had dug a hole in flat ground, lined it, roofed it with sod, and called it finished. The first hard August rain dumped 3 inches of water into the cellar in 2 hours. The stonework, which had been set dry without the pressure of proper backfill, shifted when the clay behind it saturated. 2 courses on the north side slumped inward. The roof sagged over the slump. Margaret Hollister was inside with the 3 children. When the wall section gave, she got the children out. She did not get herself out before the second section slumped and pinned her legs under 300 pounds of wet stone. Clement Voss rode to Mara's claim at a full gallop. She was at the pit, fitting replacement stone on the vent collar. She heard what had happened, told Owen to stay with Nora, who had come that morning to work on her own cellar, and rode the old mule south at the fastest pace the animal could manage. The Hollister cellar was half collapsed. Ray was digging at the stone pile with his bare hands, his fingers bloody. The children were standing in the grass, silent, watching their father claw at rock. Margaret was conscious. Mara could hear her voice from inside the rubble, thin but steady, calling out that she could feel her legs, and could someone please move the stone that was on her left knee? Mara climbed into the wreckage. She did not dig randomly. She assessed the way Thomas would have assessed, which stones were load-bearing, which could be moved without triggering further collapse, where the weight above was still supported and where it was hanging free. She found the stone on Margaret's knee and the one across her thighs, and worked them loose in sequence, levering with the pry bar Thomas had given her, bracing each gap with a flat piece before moving the next. It took 40 minutes. Margaret's left knee was shattered, and her thighs were bruised deep enough that the skin had already turned black. But she was alive. Clement arrived with the wagon, and they carried her out. Mara looked at the ruined cellar and felt something she had not expected. Anger, not at the Hollisters, at the gap between the idea and the execution. They had copied the shape without understanding the system. Round walls and stone lining were not enough. Without drainage, the walls sat in water. Without a sump, the floor became a pool. Without proper backfill pressure, the stone lining was just rocks stacked in a wet hole. She had almost made the same mistakes. Would have made them if Thomas had not arrived and named them. "You need a trench before you need a wall," Mara told Ray Hollister, standing beside the collapsed cellar with her hands still covered in clay dust. "You need a sump before you need a floor, and you need someone to check your batter before you backfill, because once the earth is behind the stone, you cannot fix the angle." "I thought I had the angle right." "The angle looked right, but the base courses need to be plumb. Vertical. 3 courses straight up before you start the lean. Your base was already tilting inward, and when the water softened the clay, the tilt became a slide." She drew the cross-section in the dirt with the pry bar, the way she would have drawn it on paper if she had any. The vertical base courses, the gradual lean. The drainage trench angled away from the entry, the gravel sump at the low point, each element connected to the next, each one dependent on the others. Ray Hollister looked at the drawing, then at his ruined cellar, then at Mara. "Can you show me how to rebuild it?" he said. "I can. But you dig. Every stone." The words came out of her mouth before she realized they were the same words she had said to Nora, the same condition Thomas had set for her. The knowledge passed forward, not as a gift, but as a trade, labor for learning, effort for understanding. The student did the work. The teacher corrected what would kill them. Silas Pettigrew did not come to the Hollister collapse. He did not offer materials or credit or labor. But he heard about it within the day, and what he heard changed his calculation in ways that comfort would not have. A woman's cellar had collapsed because it was built without proper drainage. The same woman had copied the Kincaid method. If imitators were getting hurt, the Kincaid method was dangerous. If the Kincaid method was dangerous, Pettigrew had leverage. He could point to the Hollister failure as proof that underground shelter was reckless, that proper frame construction was the only safe approach, and that his lumberyard was the community's real protection. He said exactly this at the supply yard on a Saturday morning when a group of claimants came in for nails and tar paper. "Underground shelter collapsed on a woman and nearly killed her," Pettigrew said, loud enough for the yard to hear. That's what happens when you take building advice from someone who's never framed a wall in her life. Digging holes and stacking creek rock is not construction. It's gambling with your family. Word reached Mara that afternoon through Clement, who had been in the yard buying hinge stock. She did not go to the supply yard. She did not confront Pettigrew publicly. Instead, she did something that hurt him worse than argument. She rebuilt the Hollister cellar. Over the next 2 weeks, Mara supervised Ray Hollister through a complete reconstruction. New trench, properly graded. New sump, 18 inches deep. She said the number without hesitation, the correction Thomas had given her now permanent in her memory. New base courses, plumb, verified by a rope-hung weight Thomas had shown her how to make. New batter starting at the 4th course. New backfill tamped in layers as the wall rose. When it was finished, 4 families came to see it. They brought questions, not mockery. How deep should the trench be? What angle carries the water? How do you know when the batter's right? How thick should the rafters be? Mara answered every question with a number. 8 inches for the trench, southeast angle, 1 inch of drop per 10 feet, 4 degrees of lean at the 4th course, increasing to 8 at the top, 5 inches of rafter diameter for a 14-foot span. She answered with numbers because numbers could be checked, repeated, and applied. Numbers did not require trust. They required a measuring stick. Pettigrew heard about the rebuilt cellar. He heard about the families visiting. He heard about the questions and the numbers and the woman standing in a hole in the ground with a pry bar in her hand, teaching grown men how to lay stone. The arithmetic of his supply business was changing. People were still buying lumber. Roofs needed poles. Doors needed planks. Vent collars needed frames. But they were buying less of it. A family that dug a storm cellar needed $40 worth of timber. A family that built a frame cabin needed $200. The difference was Pettigrew's margin, and the margin was shrinking. He could not stop the spread. The tornado had made the argument that no amount of lumberyard rhetoric could answer. Frame cabins had been erased. The pit home had held. People remembered which shelter they had survived in and which ones had killed their neighbors. That memory was worth more than any advertisement Pettigrew could have run, and it was free. The hostility did not leave Pettigrew's face, but it changed shape. It became quieter, more watchful, the expression of a man who was not yet beaten, but who could see the direction of the fight. By September of 1905, Mara had helped build or advised on 6 storm cellars and 2 full pit homes within a 10-mile radius of her claim. The work was unpaid, except in trade, was a bushel of corn from the Hollisters, a smoked ham from a family named Garrett, a set of iron door hinges from a blacksmith in Hobart who had seen the Kincaid pit and asked Mara to inspect his own cellar design before he dug. The blacksmith's name was Boyd Picket. He was 36, widowed, with a 7-year-old daughter named Ruth, who had the same quiet watchfulness that Owen had. Picket had been shoeing horses and repairing wagon hardware in Hobart since before the opening, and he understood materials the way Thomas understood stone, not from theory, but from years of handling iron and wood and heat and weight. He came to the Kincaid claim on a September afternoon to deliver the hinges. Mara was below grade, replacing a stone in the upper wall that had cracked during the August heat cycle. Picket stood at the rim of the pit and watched her work. "You're resetting that stone dry," he said. "That's how the wall is built, dry stack throughout." "I can see that, but the crack runs along the grain. When winter comes and the moisture in the stone expands, that crack will widen. If you set a thin iron strap across the break, 2 flat bars, one on each face, pinned through the stone with a single bolt, the strap holds the stone together through the expansion, and the crack stays stable." Mara looked at him. Then she looked at the cracked stone, which she had been planning to remove and replace entirely, a 2-hour job that required pulling the course above it, lifting the cracked piece, fitting a new one, and resetting everything. "How long to make the strap?" she asked. "An hour at the forge. I'll make it from scrap stock." "How much?" "I didn't come here to sell you iron. I came to deliver hinges, and I noticed the crack." He paused. "I'll make the strap and bring it tomorrow. If it works, you let me watch how you set the drainage trench on the garret cellar. I want to understand the grading before I start mine." Knowledge for knowledge. Iron for method. The same trade Mara had learned to make since the tornado, and the same trade Thomas had taught her by example. Nobody worked for free. Everybody worked for understanding. Picket brought the strap the next day. It fit perfectly, 2 flat iron bars, each 8 inches long and an inch wide, seated against the stone faces and bolted through a hole he had drilled through the crack with a masonry bit. The bolt drew the bars tight, and the cracked stone locked solid. Mara pressed her palm against it and felt nothing move. "That's good iron work," she said. "That's good stone work to put it in," Picket said. He watched the garret drainage trench that afternoon, asking questions about angle and depth and sump placement the way the other families had. But his questions were different. They were about connections. Where stone met timber, where timber met iron, where the roof ring seated on the wall, and how the joint held under load. He was thinking about the whole system, not just the parts. Mara noticed. She answered his questions with more detail than she had given others, not because she owed him for the strap, but because he was asking the right questions, the ones that meant he would build something that worked, and that his daughter would be safe in it. The autumn brought a new rhythm. Mara's days divided between maintaining her own pit, advising on others, and expanding her living space. She added a stone-lined food alcove, a smaller pit dug adjacent to the main chamber, 4 feet deep and 6 feet across, connected by a short tunnel at floor level. The alcove stayed cooler than the main room, cool enough to keep root vegetables and preserved meat through the summer heat. Thomas had mentioned the concept in passing, an adaptation of Earth Lodge storage design, and Mara worked out the construction details on her own. Owen, who turned 7 that October, had become part of the operation. He could not lift stone, but he could measure. Mara taught him to cut a rope to a specific length and use it as a radius line, walking the circle to check that every point was equidistant from the center peg. He could test the batter by holding a straight stick vertical against the wall and measuring the gap at the top if the gap was wider than his thumb at the 4th course. The lean had started too early. He told his mother once that the pit smelled different in autumn than in summer. Summer smelled like damp clay and cook smoke. Autumn smelled like cold stone and root vegetables, and the particular scent of earth when it begins to contract for winter. Mara knew that smell. It was the smell of the Texas cellar, the smell of her father's hands after a day of stonework. She had carried it all the way to Oklahoma without knowing she was carrying anything. Elias Rooker came by in late October, not to inspect, not to advise. He came because he was building a storm cellar on his rebuilt claim, and he wanted Mara to check his stonework before he started the backfill. The reversal was complete. The man who had ridden to her claim to pronounce sentence was now riding to her claim to ask for verification. He did not make a performance of the request. He simply said, "I've got 6 courses up, and I want to know if the batter's right before the dirt goes behind it." She rode out to his claim the next morning. His stonework was competent. The base courses were plumb. The lean started at the 4th course. The stone selection was good, but the drainage trench was too shallow by 3 inches, and the sump was off-center. She corrected both without apology, the way Thomas would have corrected them, by pointing to the specific error and stating the specific fix. Rooker accepted the corrections without argument. He dug the trench deeper. He recentered the sump. 3 inches, he said, looking at the deepened trench. 3 inches of drainage trench depth. 3 inches of depth is the difference between a dry floor and a flooded one, Mara said. The water doesn't care what you intended. It goes where the ground lets it. Rooker nodded. He had been building houses for 30 years, and a woman half his age was teaching him where to point the water. The indignity of it was visible in his jaw. The acceptance of it was visible in the fact that he kept digging. By November, Pettigrew's position had shifted from attack to adaptation. He could not stop the spread of earth-sheltered building. He could not compete with free stone and labor-traded knowledge. What he could do was position himself as the supplier for the components that underground construction still required: timber for roof rings and rafters, tar paper for moisture barriers, iron hardware for doors and vents. He came to Mara's claim on a cold morning in early November, riding a mule because his horse had thrown a shoe. Mara was below grade, fitting the last stone in the food alcove wall, when she heard his voice at the rim. Kincaid. She climbed out. Pettigrew stood on the surface with his arms at his sides, not crossed, not braced, just hanging, the posture of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was not sure he could say it. "I need to ask you something," he said. Mara waited. "A family named Draper came to me last week wanting lumber for a pit home roof. I sold them the poles and the tar paper, but they asked me how thick the rafters should be for a 12-foot span, and I told them 3.5 inches, because that's what I'd use for a cabin rafter at that span. 3.5 inches is too thin. I know that now. I didn't know it then. They haven't built the roof yet. I told them 3.5 inches would bow inside a month and collapse inside a year." Pettigrew nodded slowly. He was hearing the same kind of numbers Thomas had given Mara: specific, consequential, measurable. The difference between 3.5 and 5 inches. The difference between a roof and a grave. "I'll tell the Drapers," he said, "and I'll stock 5-inch poles. But I need to know the right numbers for everything: span, diameter, spacing, ring dimensions, because people are going to keep asking me, and I cannot keep selling material for something I don't understand. Then come back when the Drapers are ready to build. I'll walk the roof with you." Pettigrew looked as though he had expected a refusal. He had come prepared for gloating, for revenge, for the satisfaction a person earns by turning away the man who humiliated them. He had not prepared for a straightforward answer. "All right," he said. He mounted his mule and rode back toward Hobart. Mara watched him go and felt nothing like triumph. She felt tired and aware that the man who had mocked her was now carrying her numbers to other people's builds, and that if those numbers were wrong, families would die. The weight of that responsibility was different from the weight of stone. Stone could be measured and set and verified. Responsibility just accumulated. She went back underground and finished the alcove wall. The winter of 1905 tested the pit home in a way the tornado had not. The tornado had been violent and brief, an hour of destruction followed by stillness. Winter was slow and constant. It pressed against the structure for months, and in pressing, it revealed what worked and what needed correction. The temperature above ground dropped to 9 degrees below zero on the coldest night in January. Inside the pit, at floor level, The air held steady at 41 degrees. Mara tracked the numbers with a mercury thermometer Nora had given her as a Christmas trade. Nora's preserves for Mara's help finishing the Voss cellar. 41 degrees was not warm. It was cold enough to see breath, cold enough that Owen slept under 2 blankets and the wool coat Clement had brought from a Hobart trade. But 41 degrees was survivable without burning fuel faster than it could be replaced, and on the plains in January, survivable was the only measure that mattered. The cook fire burned low and steady. The vent drew the smoke upward, even in wind, because the opening sat above the surface and the draft channel ran straight. On windless nights, when the air sat heavy and still, the draw weakened and smoke collected at the ceiling. Mara learned to crack the door bar 1 inch on those nights, just enough to let fresh air seep in at floor level and push the smoke column up through the vent. The adjustment was small. The difference in air quality was enormous. Owen developed a winter cough that worried her for 3 weeks in February. She raised the sleeping platform another 6 inches, closer to the ceiling where the air was warmest, and hung a damp cloth over the vent at night to trap some of the heat escaping through the opening. The cough eased. The boy slept deeper. The room held. The food alcove earned its cost in January. Root vegetables stored there in October. Turnips, carrots, a small stock of potatoes traded from the Garrett family stayed firm and unsprouted through the winter. The temperature in the alcove was even more stable than the main room, hovering between 38 and 42 degrees regardless of surface conditions. Mara added shelving made from scrap planks and organized the space with the precision of someone who understood that wasted food was wasted survival. By March, when the ground thawed and the grass returned, the pit home had been occupied for 10 months. The stone walls showed no movement. The drainage trench had carried snow melt and spring rain without flooding the entry. The sod roof had settled and knitted, the grass roots interlocking across the surface until the mound looked less like a construction and more like a natural rise in the prairie. From a distance, the Kincaid claim appeared to be empty. Up close, smoke rose from a stone-rimmed vent, a plank door cut into the earth at an angle, and a boy played on top of the mound where his mother lived. The Drapers built their roof in late March, and Pettigrew came to watch. Mara had ridden out to the Draper claim twice already, once to verify the wall work, once to correct a drainage angle that Ray Draper had set too steeply, which would have caused the trench to erode and undercut the entry ramp. By the time the roof went on, the Draper cellar was sound. 12 feet across, 8 feet deep, stone-lined with proper batter, drained to the southeast. Pettigrew stood at the rim and watched Mara set the timber ring. She placed the 5-inch rafter poles herself, demonstrating the spacing, 16 inches on the Draper span, tighter than her own 14-foot pit because the smaller diameter concentrated the roof load over a shorter distance. 16 inches on a 12-foot span, Mara said loud enough for Pettigrew to hear. Not 18. The load per rafter is higher on a shorter span because the weight distribution changes. If you space at 18 here, the center poles carry too much and the edge poles carry too little. Pettigrew wrote the number on a piece of brown paper he had brought. He had a list. Mara could see the columns, span width, rafter diameter, rafter spacing, ring dimensions, sod depth. He was building a reference table. He was translating what she knew into something he could sell. She did not stop him. If Pettigrew sold correct numbers along with his lumber, fewer families would build roofs that collapsed. The knowledge spreading through a supply yard reached more people than the knowledge spreading through one woman walking between claims. After the Draper roof was set and the first layer of brush was laid, Pettigrew asked to see the underside. He climbed down the entry ramp and stood in the cellar, looking up at the rafter pattern against the ring. The ring is bearing the full roof load, he said. It was not a question. He was working it out. The ring transfers the load to the wall top. The wall transfers it to the earth. The earth carries it down and out. Nothing pushes up. Nothing pushes sideways if the batter is right. In a frame cabin, the roof load goes through the rafters to the plate beam to the wall, studs to the sill to the foundation. Same principle. Same principle, different direction. Your cabin pushes the load down through vertical members. The pit pushes the load down through angled members into a ring, into a curved wall, to surrounding earth. The earth is the foundation, the wall, and the insulation. The cabin has to create all three separately. Pettigrew looked at the walls for a long time. Then he said, "I've been building the wrong direction for 30 years." He did not say it with drama. He said it with the flatness of a man restating a measurement. The wrong direction. Vertical when it should have been circular. Above grade when it should have been below. Fighting the wind when he could have disappeared beneath it. Mara did not respond. The statement did not require a response. It required the silence that follows a man revising the central assumption of his professional life. They climbed out. Pettigrew folded the brown paper into his coat pocket, mounted his mule, and rode back to Hobart. On the ride back, he passed the spot where the Dunfree cabin had stood before the tornado. The foundation scar was still visible, a rectangle of flat earth where the corner posts had been, now grown over with spring grass. A house that had stood upright and square and disappeared in minutes. He did not look at it. He did not need to. The rectangle was in his arithmetic now, the same way Mara's circles were in hers. Boyd Picket came to the Kincaid claim every week that spring. The visits began as material deliveries. Iron straps for Nora's cellar, a replacement bolt for the Hollister rebuild, hinge pins for 3 new entry doors. They continued because Picket had questions that only Mara could answer, and because Mara had problems that only Picket could solve. The collaboration was specific and practical. Mara knew stone and earth. Picket knew iron and wood joinery. Where the two met, at the timber ring, at the door frame, at the vent collar, at every point where the above-ground components joined the below-ground structure, neither was expert alone. The door bar was the first project they solved together. Mara's original bar was a cottonwood beam seated in timber brackets. It worked, but the fit was loose, and in the tornado the bar had flexed enough to let the door shift inward a 1/4 inch. A 1/4 inch of flex in a door during a tornado was a 1/4 inch of air breach. An air breach under those conditions could start the chain that ended with the roof lifting. Picket forged a new bar from iron stock, a flat beam, 1½ inches thick and 4 inches wide, fitted into forged iron brackets bolted through the stone wall on either side of the door frame. When the bar seated, the brackets locked it so tightly that no flex was possible. Mara tested it by leaning her full weight against the door and pushing. The bar did not move. The brackets did not move. The stone the brackets were bolted into did not move. "That's strong enough to hold in a storm," Mara said. "That's strong enough to hold if someone tries to break in," Picket said, "which is a different problem but not an irrelevant one." She looked at him. He was not talking about storms. He was talking about a woman living alone on a claim in the territory with a 7-year-old boy and no husband and no weapon heavier than a pry bar. The iron door bar was protection that worked in 2 directions, against weather and against people, and Picket had designed it with both in mind without being asked. "Thank you," Mara said. "It's ironwork. I make ironwork." "You made ironwork that solves a problem I hadn't named yet." Picket looked at the door bar, and then at Mara, and then at the ground, the way men look at the ground when they have been noticed doing something kind and do not know what to do with the attention. Their daughter and son, Ruth and Owen, had already settled into the particular alliance of children who share proximity and boredom. Ruth was quiet and methodical. The kind of child who watched adults work and then replicated the movements with smaller tools. Owen was louder, more impulsive, more likely to test a stone's weight by dropping it than by measuring. Together, they made a reasonable team. Ruth measured. Owen hauled. Both of them understood that the work their parents did was important in a way that did not require explanation. The courtship, if that was the word for it, advanced through iron and stone. Picket forged vent collars for 2 new cellars Mara was advising. Mara showed Picket how to set a timber ring so the bolts seated without splitting the wood. He brought a stew pot one evening and cooked venison in the pit while Mara finished the alcove shelving. She asked him about tempering iron, and his explanation, the color of the metal, the speed of the quench, the sound of the hammer at the right temperature, had the same quality as Thomas Redbird's teaching. Specific, earned, delivered through sensation, not lecture. In late May, a year and 2 weeks after the tornado, Picket asked Mara if she would consider a partnership. He did not use the word marriage. He used the word partnership, and the distinction was deliberate. "I'm not asking to take over your claim or your work," he said. They were sitting on the mound above the pit, watching Owen and Ruth chase each other through the drainage trench. "I'm asking to add a forge to the operation. You build the structures. I build the hardware. Together we cover the full system: stone, earth, timber, iron." "And the children?" "The children already think they're related. Might as well make it official." Mara did not answer immediately. She looked at the prairie, which was green with spring grass, and at the smoke rising from the vent, and at the entry cut where the iron door bar gleamed dull in the afternoon light. She had built the pit alone, or nearly alone, with Thomas's teaching and Nora's cornmeal and Clement's hauling and Owen's counting. She had proved the claim alone. She had survived the tornado and the winter and the doubt alone. But alone was a tool, not a virtue. It had kept her alive when no help was available. It was not required when help arrived on its own terms, offered by someone who understood her work and respected it enough to want to build beside it, not on top of it. "Build the forge first," she said. "Then we'll talk about official." Picket built the forge in June, a stone and iron structure set 20 yards from the pit entry, low to the ground, with a tool storage. Each addition followed the same logic: low, heavy, earth-backed, presenting minimal surface to the wind. The compound looked from a distance like a cluster of low mounds with smoke rising from 2 points. From the inside, it was warm, dry, organized, and capable of supporting a family of 4 through anything the Oklahoma sky could deliver. The next 2 years compressed the way years do when work becomes rhythm. Mara and Picket advised on 14 underground shelters between 1906 and 1908. The structures varied: full pit homes for families starting from nothing, storm cellars for families with existing cabins, hybrid builds that combined above-grade living with below-grade safety rooms. Each project taught them something. Picket developed a standardized door bar system that could be installed in any pit home in half a day. Mara refined her drainage calculations for different soil types. The clay south of Hobart drained differently than the sandy loam near the Washita, and the trench specifications changed accordingly. Owen turned 9, then 10. He could set a base course by himself, slowly, checking each stone with the stick-and-gap method Mara had taught him, and his circles were true within an inch at any diameter. Ruth, 8 years old, had begun drawing cross-sections of pit homes in charcoal on scrap paper, labeling the components in her careful, blocky handwriting: ring, rafter, batter, sump. She drew the drainage trench with arrows showing the direction of water flow and labeled the arrows away. Rooker, who had completed his own storm cellar with Mara's inspection, became an unexpected advocate. He traveled between claims in his capacity as the settlement's most experienced builder and recommended underground shelter to every new family he met. He did not claim credit for the method. He said simply, "Go see Kincaid. She'll show you how to build something that stands." The phrase entered the settlement's vocabulary the way practical phrases do, through repetition, through results, through the accumulated weight of families who had built what Mara showed them and survived what the plains delivered. Go see Kincaid meant, before you build, before you raise a wall or set a post, go to the woman on the flat claim 7 miles southwest and ask her where to point the water. Pettigrew's supply yard adapted. He stocked 5-inch poles in 3 lengths. He carried iron vent caps forged by Picket. He posted a hand-lettered sign on the counter that listed the specifications Mara had given him: rafter diameter by span width, sump depth by soil type, ring dimensions by pit circumference. He did not credit Mara on the sign. He did not need to. Everyone who read it knew where the numbers came from. He never apologized for what he had said at the supply yard the year of the tornado. Mara never asked him to. The apology, if it existed, was in the numbers on the sign. The fact that a man who had called her method a death trap was now selling materials specifically designed for it. That was not grace. It was commerce. But on the frontier, commerce and conversion often looked the same. In the spring of 1909, 4 years after the tornado, a county surveyor named Alden Marsh rode through the settlement documenting structures for a territorial assessment. He stopped at the Kincaid claim because it did not match anything in his classification system. His forms had categories for frame cabins, sod houses, dugouts, and tent structures. He did not have a category for a stone-lined underground compound with an above-grade kitchen, a forge, and a food storage alcove connected by a subterranean passage. Mara showed him the pit. He climbed down the ramp and stood in the room, looking at the walls and the ceiling and the vent and the drainage, and he asked questions that were different from any she had been asked before. Not how to build it, how to classify it. "It's a dwelling," Mara said. "It's underground." "The kitchen is above ground." "The kitchen is 3 walls and a roof with an earth berm on 3 sides. It's barely above ground." "It's above the surface. The living quarters are below. The food storage is adjacent and below. The forge is above and separate." Marsh wrote for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "How many structures like this are in the county?" Mara thought about it. The pit homes, full underground dwellings, numbered 3, including hers. The storm cellars and hybrid builds numbered 11. The families who had adopted some element of the method, drainage trenching, stone-lined walls, earth-bermed construction, numbered more than she could count precisely. "In the county, maybe 30 structures that use the principles," she said. "Full pit homes, 3, cellars, about a dozen, earth-bermed additions, the rest." "Who designed them?" "I built the first one. Thomas Redbird taught me the stonework. Boyd Picket makes the hardware." Thomas Redbird. A Kiowa stoneworker. He's in Anadarko. He corrected my batter and taught me the drainage and the roof system. Marsh wrote this down. Mara watched him write it and felt something she had not felt since the tornado. Not pride exactly, but the awareness that the work had become large enough to require documentation. Something that began as desperation, a woman digging a hole because she could not build a cabin, had become a method. The method had become a practice. The practice had become part of the settlement's identity, recorded in a surveyor's notebook in a category that did not yet exist. Thomas Redbird came back one more time. It was October of 1909, 4.5 years after the tornado, and Mara had not seen him since his departure in June of 1905. He rode up to the claim on a different horse, older, slower, matching the change in the man himself. Thomas was 55 now. His hands were stiffer. His face was thinner. But his eyes did the same thing they had always done. They found the stone first, then the person. He walked the perimeter of the compound without speaking. He touched the wall of the above-grade kitchen. He crouched at the entry ramp and ran his fingers along the stone lining. He descended into the pit and stood in the center and looked up at the roof, where the same 22 rafter poles, including the one that had bowed a quarter-inch, held the same sod-covered weight they had held since April of 1905. Owen, now 10, was standing at the top of the ramp watching. Ruth stood beside him. Thomas came back up. He looked at the forge, the tool storage, the drainage system that now served the entire compound through a network of interconnected trenches Mara had expanded over 4 years. He looked at the iron vent caps, the forged door bars, the standardized hardware that Picket produced in the forge. "You built more than a house," Thomas said. "I built what was needed. You built a method. That's different. A house, you built the idea." He stayed for 3 days. He inspected 2 of the newer cellars and corrected a batter angle on a build Mara had not yet visited. He sat with Picket at the forge and discussed iron fastening for stone walls, a technique Mara had not considered, where iron pins set into drilled holes could lock courses together against lateral shift during earthquakes or severe ground movement. It was beyond what the settlement needed, but it was the kind of conversation that Thomas had with everyone, not about what was required, but about what was possible. On the morning he left, he shook Picket's hand, nodded to Owen and Ruth, and walked with Mara to the edge of the claim the way she had walked with him 4 years before. "You won't see me again for a while," he said. "My sister needs me. The work up there is different. Fences, walls, cattle handling structures. Not the same as this." "Not the same, but the same stone. The same stone." He mounted. He looked at the compound, the low green mounds, the smoke from 2 vents, the children playing on the surface of a house that had survived a tornado and 4 winters and was still holding weight as if the earth had always meant to carry it. "The round wall holds because every stone depends on the stone beside it," Thomas said. He had said it before, the day he first left. He was saying it again because it was still true, and because the truth of it had expanded beyond stone into the settlement itself, families depending on families, knowledge depending on knowledge, each piece pressing against the next in a circle that tightened under pressure. He rode southeast. Mara watched him until the grass took him. She did not know, standing there, that she would not see Thomas Redbird again. His sister's household needed him through the following winter, and the winter after that, and by the time travel became easy again, the distance had settled into permanence, the way distances do on the plains. She learned years later that he had continued his stonework near Anadarko, culverts, retaining walls, one small bridge footing over a creek that washed out every spring until Thomas set the abutments in a curve that deflected the current instead of fighting it. The same logic. Always the same logic. She kept his pry bar. It hung on the wall of the pit beside the entry ramp, the curved tip worn bright from use, the grip smooth from 25 years of hands. Owen used it after her. Ruth drew it once, in charcoal on paper, with the label Thomas's Bar. Mara Bell Kincaid, Mara Picket, by the final years, lived on the same claim for the rest of her life. The compound grew slowly. A second above-grade room for the children, a covered passage between the kitchen and the pit, an expanded forge with a proper bellows, and a second anvil for Picket's growing hardware trade. But the original pit home remained the center. Mara slept underground until the year she died, in a room where the air was always cool and still, and the stone walls rang clean when she pressed her palm against them. Owen married a woman from the Washita settlement and built his own pit home on adjacent land, measuring drainage before walls, the way his mother had taught him. Ruth became a draftswoman, one of the first women in the county to draw construction plans for pay, and her cross-sections of earth-sheltered structures circulated through the territory with the labels she had invented as a child: ring, rafter, batter, sump, and the arrows marked away. Picket died in 1921 from a heart attack at the forge. Mara outlived him by 6 years. She spent those years in the pit, alone again the way she had begun, with Owen checking on her every morning, and Ruth sending letters from Oklahoma City with drawings enclosed, buildings, bridges, structures that owed their logic to a woman in a hole with a pry bar and a dead man's cellar trick. She died in 1927 in the same room where she had held 7 people through a tornado. Owen found her on the sleeping platform with the blanket pulled up and the vent cap open and the morning light falling through the entry ramp in a stripe that crossed the stone floor the way it had crossed it every morning for 22 years. By 1910, more than 30 families in Kiowa County had built some form of earth-sheltered structure using the method Mara had taught. The stone-lined storm cellar became standard practice on open claims where timber was expensive and tornadoes were not theoretical. Each one was round. Each one was drained. Each one carried Thomas Redbird's batter and Mara Kincaid's arithmetic and Boyd Pickett's iron in its walls. Mara lived the remainder of her years on the same flat quarter section she had proved in 1901. The claim that Del Kincaid abandoned became the claim that bore his name only on the filing document. Everyone in the county called it the Kincaid place, but they meant Mara. They meant the woman who went down when everyone else went up, who lined the walls with stone because she could not afford to line them with wood, who survived the worst storm the settlement had seen by building the kind of shelter that the storm could not find. On May 10th, 1905, Elias Rooker, a man who had built 30 houses and buried a wife, told Mara Bell Kincaid that the roof of her pit home would come down on her little boy. 22 years later, the roof still held. The rafter that had bowed a quarter inch in the tornado had not bowed further. The timber ring was seated. The stone was locked. The drainage trench still carried water away from the entry in a shallow grade toward the southeast, 1 inch of drop per 10 feet, the way Thomas Redbird had marked it with a stick in the dirt, while a woman with split knuckles and $31 watched and learned. Above the prairie, the wind moved the grass in long, dark bands the way it always had, bending the stems flat and releasing them, flat and releasing in a rhythm that looked like breathing. Below the grass, almost invisible from any distance, a low green mound rose barely above the surface, stone-rimmed at the entry, smoke lifting from a cracked vent into the calm air. A buried house, still standing, still warm, still holding weight the way round walls hold weight, every stone pressed against its neighbor, every neighbor pressing back, the circle tightening under the very pressure that was meant to break it.